Alright, we'll begin with I'm Madison Ostrowski, and I'm here interviewing Marlene Crosby, who is my grandmother. And today is November 23rd, 2016, and we are conducting this interview in my house in Inglewood, Colorado. Alright, I'm just going to call you Grandma to start with, and you go by Marlene mostly for everyone else. Where were you born?
I was born in Gunnison, Colorado.
And when was your birthday?
When was I born?
Yep.
1948, December 4th, 1948.
All right, and what was the name of your parents?
My parents were Harold and Zarifa McMillan.
And what did they do for a living?
They moved to Gunnison because my father had asthma and his health was better there. Did a number of things for a living. My father was the parts man at an international harvester dealership that sold farm equipment and tractors and had a big repair facility. And my mom did the bookkeeping there.
That's pretty cool. So you had siblings. Did you just have your sister? Or?
I just had one sister 8 years older than I am.
And was there any military presence in your family? Any uncles or any person in the military?
You know, not that I knew. My dad's brother, Emmett, was in World War II. And the only thing I know about that experience was that we never were allowed to give any money or any contributions to the Red Cross because during World War II, there was a group of them, maybe just a very discreet group, that took the boxes people sent to their families and sold them to the soldiers. Wow. And my father was so distressed about that we never did anything for the Red Cross.
Wow. So what are some of your fondest memories of your childhood?
You know, my childhood was different maybe than a lot of other kids. My dad died before I started to school. And so it was just my mom and my sister and I. And Mom always had to work, obviously, to support us. But it was a happy time. My sister, I remember we did a lot of things together. We made Christmas ornaments. We made Christmas cookies. Because Gunnison's a small rural community, you could be all over town. You weren't in confined space. You could ride your bike anywhere you wanted to go. It was just a very relaxed, different world than today.
So what was it like attending school in Gunnison, starting from elementary school?
It was good. I got an excellent education. I think it was more, maybe organized isn't the right word, but more systematic than it is now, because in first grade you learned one thing, in second grade they built on it, on third grade they added more. And so I got an excellent education. The classes were small, the teachers all knew your families and the families of the kids in your class, and we all knew that if you got in trouble at school, you were in real trouble at home.
All right. So what was your favorite subject in school?
Well, reading, which later became literature.
Did you have a teacher that you kind of were more fond of than others?
I had a number of good teachers. My third grade teacher taught us the Palmer method of penmanship. I still use that to this day. Yeah. She was an excellent teacher. Interestingly enough, she had had my older sister as a student. And then I had a fifth grade teacher. We were combined fourth and fifth grade, not because of the number of students, but because they were trying that combination of classes.
Yeah.
And she was very creative, let you use your imagination, which of course we all had a good imagination because we didn't have toys and electronics. We had our imaginations, but I still remember the fun things that we did that year. Study of Lewis and Clark, and we had a student in the 4th grade that spoke French, and that was my first exposure to foreign language. Was we had French every day,
Yeah.
so it was a fun year.
What year did you graduate from high school?
1967.
And you met your high school sweetheart, right? Or
You know, my high school sweetheart was 2 years older than I am.
mm-hmm.
Had kind of always known him,
Mm-hmm.
but had never dated until we went to the junior-senior prom together.
And what was his name?
His name was Bob Poloni.
Okay.
His family, his dad and his 2 brothers, came over from Italy.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was cool.
And I'm sorry. And he was 2 years. So how did he propose to you? How did thought of marriage come up for the two of you?
We had gone together for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and he had gone to the Air Force, and I was in college. Of course, I finished high school while he was in the service, and then I was in college, and he was assigned to Torrejon Air Force Base in Madrid, Spain. And because you didn't do long distance calling then, everything was done in letters. He asked me to marry him in a letter. And it was kind of interesting because my best friend from high school and I had always agreed that she would be my bridesmaid or maid of honor, and I would be hers. But unfortunately, I went to Spain to get married 1 week before she got married, so it didn't work out either way.
Oh. And how did your family feel about your decision to move to Spain?
Apprehensive, but then excited. It was an exciting time for me. I'd never flown. And so Bob's mom and my mom took me to Denver and caught the plane and flew to New York City. All solo. It was during the air traffic controller strike. And so we taxied on the runway for 2 hours waiting to take off. Got to Spain early in the morning because of the time change.
Mm-hmm.
And before we could have a ceremony on base, which was performed by the base chaplain, we had to be married by a Spanish judge. And so he sat at a desk with his white shirt and a suit on and thongs and married us, I assume, because I didn't speak that much Spanish. And then we had a ceremony on base that Bob had and his friends had totally put together with the base chaplain and the guys from his unit in the Air Force.
That's pretty interesting to hear about. So, you didn't know much Spanish when you went. How was that going through the airport or traveling to?
It was okay traveling because there weren't the restrictions with the TSA and all those things there are now. A little more stressful living initially because we did not live in base. We lived in a town called Alcalá de Henares, and it's the birthplace of Miguel Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote. And so it was kind of a fun, historic town, but we lived on the 4th floor of an apartment building, and nobody there spoke English. And the only Spanish I had, when I found out I was going to Spain, I took college Spanish in a class where everybody else had had high school Spanish but me.
Mm-hmm.
And the teacher was Costa Rican, and she knew very little English. So the only way I ever even knew what page of the book we were on was looking over somebody's shoulder and turning to the right page. So I knew very little Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not a problem because the Spaniards liked Americans and they respected Americans. And so I would just wave my arms and draw pictures or get out my little book, and I could do what I needed to do.
So, I assume you made friends while you were in Spain. Did they have any opinions, or could you pick up of any opinions they had about Vietnam?
We did have friends because we lived in a building that was all but one couple in 5 floors, four apartments on a floor, 5 floors. Only one other group of Americans lived there. But I think the Spaniards were envious of the Americans, but they were very respectful. That's why there was a base. There was a Navy base in Rota. There was the Air Force base in Spain, in Madrid, and a smaller base in Zaragoza. And they were envious of the material things that Americans had, but they were supportive. They were European allies.
Did you and your husband have any conversations about what was possibly going on in Vietnam, or what their involvement was?
Well, you always have those conversations. They started in high school because as I graduated, the boys in my class were making the decision to go to college or to join the service or, frankly, to evade the draft. I don't know that any of them did that, but they had some tough decisions they were making right then. Back then, it wasn't a decision a woman made, particularly. One of my classmates went in the Army and became a nurse, but generally it was a decision the guys were making. And the reason my husband, many of our friends had done a tour of duty in Vietnam before they came to Madrid. Madrid was a duty station where you could have your family. And the reason his unit was there was because they didn't just do small repairs, they did the major repairs, the engine replacements, all of those things on the fighter planes from Vietnam. So they didn't want to have a plane with the engine out of it in Vietnam that might get blown up. So they would bring him either to Turkey, where he would go down and work in Turkey for 30 or 60 days, or they would bring him to Torrejon for a total rebuild and replacement. So, yeah, the war was very present.
What's your personal opinion of how the war started, or just like the war in general, like what's your personal opinion of it?
Well, my personal opinion from what I remember, and you have to remember it wasn't yesterday, is that, it was unusual in the sense it didn't really start. There was an event like there was in World War II that started it. It just started as a skirmish that grew and grew and grew, and I think ultimately took more American lives than any war since then. And my personal opinion, and the sense at that time was it's what you have to do to keep communism from creeping into our country. And so you supported it then, you support that now. My concern then was the guys who gave their lives, the guys who came back with significant injuries. They weren't the heroes that people returning from World War II and World War I and the Korean War were. They were almost substandard citizens. When my ex, but my husband at that time came back to go to college, actually the fraternity boys were given more respect than the returning veterans. And I found that so wrong.
So when you were in Spain, I assume you wrote letters. You wrote letters back home. Like, did your family members were there any people from your hometown that you were kind of surprised to join, or?
When we wrote letters back home, and my mom was older. She was 43 when I was born, and she was still busy working. And so she didn't make a lot of comments except to tell me if some of her friends or something traumatic happened. She didn't make a lot of general comments about the war. She did My mother-in-law, on the contrary, was very involved, very watchful of what was going on, because my husband's brother was stationed in Germany in the Air Force, and he had a top security clearance and was decoding a lot of the information about the war, and she was very concerned. So she was much more engaged. Of course, both of them did report. There were 2 Gunnison boys killed in Vietnam. One was a young man who'd always been an athlete, a vibrant young kid, and he got in trouble with the judge, got in legal trouble, and the judge told him he could go to jail or he could join the Marines. And he joined the Marines, and he was killed in Vietnam. And then one of my classmates' older brother was killed in Vietnam and that was kind of a sad memory about Vietnam, because when they came and told his parents, they indicated that there was maybe some horseplay going on and a pin on a grenade was pulled. And they made it sound like it was an accident. And as soon as one of his friends that was in his unit in Vietnam got out of the Army and came home, he came from the East Coast to Gunnison to tell those parents that that's not what happened at all, that the Viet Cong had infiltrated their camp and nobody knew it, and that Billy Bob threw his grenade and was the closest to the attack, but threw his grenade, which gave the other guys time to react to the Viet Cong invasion. And I always thought that was not fair to those parents.
Yeah.
And we didn't know a lot about what was going on in the United States with the protest, or there was not a lot of that in the news, because the paper that we had, the news media that we had, radio and a newspaper, was the Stars and Stripes. And it was an Air Force or an Army Air Force publication. So of course it was
A little
edited.
Biased. Yeah, a little biased.
Yeah.
So when did you come back to the United States to permanently live?
Let's see, I went over in August of 1968 and came home in November of 71.
So where did you live during that? Like, did you come back to Gunnison?
Came back to
in 71?
Gunnison, and Bob went back to college. He had had a year, and so he went back and got his degree in environmental health. And I worked and took just a few classes, but worked, combination of me working in the GI Bill and him working summers. He was able to get his bachelor's.
And you would take classes at Western State?
That's right.
When did you become a teacher? Because you became an elementary school teacher.
I did. After Bob graduated, he got a job as an environmental health director for Lake County in Leadville, Colorado, which is 100 miles from Gunnison. And so he moved there, and I had been working as a teacher's aide and had never thought about going into teaching. I was going to be in journalism. I don't know how I thought I was going to make a living, but I was going to be in journalism. But after I worked as a teacher's aide, I found I loved the kids and I loved doing that. So I had to give up my teacher's aide job because I could not get enough hours at class. So I went to work at the International Harvester dealer where my parents had worked when they first came, which of course had changed hands over time. I went to work there in the office and went back to class. So I worked 40 hours a week and took a full load at college, got my degree in elementary education and business administration. So then when I finished college, Bob was still in Leadville. I commuted and I taught 3rd grade and loved it. But in the middle of my first year of teaching, we found my mom was terminally ill. So I finished that year and I taught the next year in Leadville, and then I came home to take care of my mom.
I see. And when did you and Bob split up?
Get a divorce?
Yeah.
In 1970. late 1978.
And how did you meet your now husband?
I was working after I gave up teaching job, came back to the International Harvester Dealer, and I had worked in the office, and there was an opening in the parts department, and I decided I needed to try something different. So they pretty much let me. I worked around in the shop or wherever, and so I was selling parts, and there were a local business called C&H Construction, two partners that had a D7 dozer, and they came in and bought parts, and one of those partners was Don Crosby. And so then we talked a lot, had a lot in common. Both of our families were from Southwest Kansas, and he did some carpentry work because I had some rentals, and I asked him to help me do something, and he did, and charged me very little. And so I told him, I said, sometime when I see you out and about, I'll buy you a drink. And so I did.
And when did you two get married?
We got married on September 19th, 1980. My mom had died that spring, and in June, on Friday the 13th, and I decided, Don and I had been going together for almost 2 years, and I decided maybe the relationship wasn't going anywhere, that maybe he just always wanted to be single.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was offered a job in Garden City, Kansas, and when I told him that I was moving, it kind of moved him along.
I see. So you now are what is your job now? I don't really know your title that well.
I'm the Deputy County Manager and the Public Works Director for Gunnison County, which is a West Slope county that it's a big county, but not very heavily populated.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I have to ask is, I've always thought of you as a very, very strong woman, and a lot of people would agree with me. What was it like during a time where women were still kind of looked at as a little bit weaker or subordinate, I guess?
You know, Madison, I don't think I ever felt that way when I was growing up, because my mom was a strong person. She had to be. She was supporting us. We were absolutely poor as church mice, but I never realized that. She just made it happen. I knew we didn't have everything everybody did, but she, I don't know that I would say she was opinionated. I would just say she was very firm in what she believed, and she was very, she was a religious person. She was a committed person to family. And so I grew up in that environment. And when I worked at the dealership, it was all guys, but the owner of the dealership's oldest daughter and I had been best friends. He actually bought the dealership from my parents and their partners. And his daughter and I had been best friends for all of our lives, and so everybody knew it was okay. The first time I ever felt that I was the minority was when I went to work at the county. And at that time it was just the road and bridge department, and they had never had a woman. And so they were looking, the dealership was closing because there were hard times in 1985. They were looking for someone who could do a lot of things, but they needed somebody who understood budgeting and typing. And I beat out the guys for the job. And actually the county manager at that time, he was the first county manager, and he was all about being the most competent. But there was reluctance to have a woman. And so my boss told the crews that because there was a woman coming on board, they couldn't use 4-letter words, and they had to clean the bathroom every day. So of course they were extremely excited to see me come on board. It took a lot of hard work to earn their respect. I would go to meetings and there were no other women in my field, So I would go to meetings, and I would just sit there and be the only woman. And it was okay. I never had to wait in line at the restroom. I was always first and last. But it was a challenge to earn their respect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I have. I've won the highest award that the American Public Works chapter in Colorado gives. And I've been the president of a number of the professional organizations. So I hope I've made it easier for the next woman. And now I go, there's many young women your age coming into the engineering field, into the professional field that's that kind of work.
So what are some of the lessons that you have learned throughout your experiences that you really would like my generation to take into consideration as we're moving on into our lives?
You know, I think one of them is that all communication cannot be written or text or emails, that you need to have the capacity and the interest in communicating one-on-one or in groups. I think eye contact's important. I think engagement's important. I'm concerned that your generation is moving away from that. I think of value, whether it's home or in the workplace, and I try and prioritize it in my workplace, is that families are the most important thing in our existence, and that if you are really struggling, you have to deal with that before you can be successful at other things, because that's the heart of who you are. And then the lesson that I think I've learned, or I continue to learn, and I practice it every day because I get that opportunity, is from Stephen Covey, and it's that I can't control what happens. I can only control how I react to it.
All right. Thank you so much.